The valley had a way of speaking even when it meant to be quiet. Larks stitched mourning into the hedgerows. A brook rattled its bright jewelry of stones. Wind rehearsed old gossip with the beeches and made them pretend to be offended. Yet in the house on the rise, Whitmore Cottage by name, though too dignified for such modesty, silence kept better hours than any servant. It drew the curtains at dusk. It laid the fire without smoke. It poured the tea so gently that no spoon dared ring the china. Silence had become a person there, and like all persons invited through grief, it had learned where the good chairs were. Lady Arabella Whitmore obeyed it almost without thought. Habit is the body's way of sparing the soul its errands, and hers had many. She rose before the village bell, 6 measured strokes, always surprised to be believed, lit her own candle, and walked the corridor where portraits of Whitmores pretended to be immortal. In daylight those faces were historical, at dawn they were merely opinionated. Arabella inclined her head to them, neither apology nor salute, and continued to the small schoolroom she had made from a former morning parlour. Chalk dust, slates, readers with pages soldiered back by ribbon. This was the country where she held office now. She placed a vase on the sill, lilac from the hedge, not for perfume. She seldom opened the window, but for proof that something in the world kept its contract with spring. Her aunt, Mrs. Pennington, knocked twice and entered with the breathless diplomacy of a woman who could make a treaty between sugar and cream. "My dear, you are early. Again. I have told the girls 8 o'clock. You may let the sun do the first lesson." "The sun charges too much for trifles," Arabella said, arranging readers by difficulty and obstinacy. "We shall begin with vowels." Her voice had the light dryness of parchment, used rarely, never wasted, and always legible. 5 years had trained it thus. Once London had known a different register, clear, warm, nimble enough to ride a melody and come down unbruised. She had sung at dinners and in parlours where men forgave each other's opinions for the pleasure of arguing later. She had sung under a sky of chandeliers, the light turned to flowers upon her shoulders, and once, exactly once, she had sung in a garden after midnight for a man who said love sounded like that, and could he live there? The next morning he had fought a duel for her name, because men love nouns more than verbs, and by evening he was dead. It did not matter that she had begged him not to go. It did not matter that honour is a word that prefers blood to grammar. Society, being practical, economized. It made her the widow of a man she had never married, the author of a tragedy she had not drafted, and the answer to a question it had not asked carefully. Cursed, some said, for they like their theology portable. Unlucky, said Kinder Lips, which is the same verdict, wearing a smaller hat. She took neither. She took the only thing that could be carried without dropping. Silence. On the night of his funeral she stood before the glass and met herself with the accuracy sorrow demands. The room smelled of lilies, made tired by their own fragrance. The mirror showed a young woman made older by the hour, hair too perfect for honesty, eyes learning not to ask questions that cannot be afforded. She pressed her fingertips to the glass, as if to test which side held the ghost. "No more," she whispered, not to love, not to music, but to the spectacle of them. She would not sing again, she would not speak of love, she would not offer the world any further material for its theatre. She made the promise before a God she could not hear, and a self she no longer entirely trusted, and then, because promises prefer witnesses, she wrote it in a little book and locked the book in a box and hung the key on a ribbon at her throat. The next day she left London. The country did what the country does. It refused to be impressed. The lanes observed her arrivals and departures without editorial. The vicar's wife brought soup without theology. The children of the village brought their muddied boots and their chaotic grammar and sat beneath Arabella's instruction like small, hopeful juries. She found, to her astonishment, that work will accept anyone who arrives on time. She mended her aunt's shawls, balanced the cottage accounts, wrote letters for tenants too proud to confess penmanship, and learned to distinguish a real storm from the sort the downs threaten on principle. Some evenings she sat at the pianoforte and did not lift the fullboard. The keys waited like loyal soldiers whose general had retired with honour. She acknowledged them with a hand upon the wood and walked away. There were exceptions to silence. Children are exempt from most tragedies' tariffs. Arabella read aloud to her pupils, voice clipped neat as paper, so that King Lear sounded almost reasonable, and the Georgics grew tomatoes in the listener's mind. She laughed sometimes, carefully, as one might handle a fragile instrument, and the sound startled her into understanding that laughter is a cousin of breath. But songs she refused, and any sentence with the word love in it learned to excuse itself. If neighbours asked after her, they were told what neighbours prefer, that she was very well, that she was useful, that she had become quite the aunt to every child within 3 miles. All of this was true in the way weather is true, accurate, insufficient. On nights when the wind thought itself an organist and tried the cottage's old joints for notes, she woke and lay still until the wind had had its entertainment. Then she rose, lit no candle, and walked to the east window where the downs practised their dark. It is possible to keep a vow and still miss the thing it forbids. She admitted this to the night and kept the rest to herself. On the 5th anniversary of the morning when bells had rung for a man's death instead of a couple's happiness, the valley chose spring with something like haste. Not the obedient green of April sermons, but the impudent green of grass that has remembered its rights. The lilacs along the hedge presented their case to the bees, who voted unanimously. Arabella dismissed her pupils early for a fete in the lower field, where a lamb misinterpreted a ribbon as philosophy and spent an hour refuting it. She returned to the cottage alone toward evening, pockets lighter by 3 peppermint lozenges and a virtue she did not name. Aunt Pennington had dozed over her embroidery, the maid had detained supper at a polite distance, the pianoforte had not taken offence. Arabella opened the schoolroom window for the first time that season. The day's warmth resigned its post, a cooler draught took the night shift. She set her hand on the sill to feel the air prove it was real. And then she heard it. A voice. Not loud, not performed, a man reading as one reads to someone for whom reading is a road back. The sound came over the hedge from the neighbouring estate, not the great house which lay another mile west, but the dower lodge let to a gentleman rumoured to prefer loneliness. The words themselves were simple, lines of a psalm tested by centuries and found durable, but the voice carrying them had a timbre that knew injury and had decided not to be ruled by it. Low, steady, not theatrical, the opposite of every drawing-room baritone that ever asked a chandelier for applause, it went through her like weather. Not a storm, not yet, the first warm wind that makes a season confess its plans. She did not move. The book page turned, the cadence shifted. Whoever listened made no sound. Arabella's hand tightened on the sill. She felt, with the clarity that sometimes frightens and sometimes frees, something inside her answer. Not the part that remembers being adored, adoration is a poor tutor, but the part that remembers being recognized. Her throat reacted before her mind obtained permission. Heat climbed, then cooled, that strange prelude, the body plays when it prepares to risk speech. He paused, perhaps to regard his listener, perhaps to find a gentler key, and then continued, "He restoreth my soul." The phrase arrived without embroidery, as water arrives to a field that has stopped expecting rain. Arabella closed her eyes. It is one thing to keep a vow. It is another to discover the world declining to keep it with you. A twig cracked in the hedge. Footsteps, careful, measured, entered the narrow path that separated cottage garden from lodge. She stepped back, not from panic, but from courtesy, as one withdraws to make space for a truth that has decided to happen. The voice came nearer, now speaking not scripture but verse, lines she recognized from a book she had refused to open for years. "And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts." Wordsworth, the mild, immoderate seducer of English evenings. When she looked again, she saw him through the leaf-work. Tall, a little stooped in the manner of men who have been taught pain by someone competent, hat carried rather than worn, the profile clean and undecorated by arrogance. He read from a small leather volume, its corners disciplined by use. Beside him, on a bench beneath the lilac, sat a young woman with a shawl and a patient smile, his sister perhaps, and the kind of stillness that is not resignation, but craft. The reader lifted his eyes from the page inadvertently, as all good readers do when checking whether the world is still there. Their gazes met across lilac and late sun. Her breath stammered, his steadied. He closed the book. "I beg your pardon," he said, voice now conversational, which meant weaker and braver. "We are your neighbors to the west. I fear we have been guilty of trespass by sound." Arabella found that English had not deserted her. "Trespass is pardoned where the fence improves the view," she replied, surprised by the ease with which the sentence arrived and landed. The corner of his mouth, a mouth built for intelligence more than beauty, considered a smile and accepted the terms. "We shall continue then with your permission." "Proceed," she said, and stepped away from the window because it felt indecent to listen so near. She did not shut it. She stood a little back in the shadow, hands folded, the key at her throat cool against skin that had remembered it could warm. The voice resumed, nothing miraculous, nothing operatic, simply a man's carefully mended courage passing through language to reach another human creature. Her vow stayed where she had placed it. And yet, the room altered marginally, the way rooms do when a candle is lit in another part of the house and light travels as rumour. She did not weep. She arranged the readers for morning and found that the piles came out almost musical. When the last line was spoken and the book closed for the night, when footsteps receded and the hedge practiced confidentiality again, Arabella crossed to the pianoforte and lifted the floorboard to touch a single key. No sound, only the cool ivory under her finger. "Not yet," she told it. The key, being patient, agreed. But when she returned to the window, the air beyond seemed to be listening for her. And for the first time since a morning, when bells had wronged her, she allowed the listening to be returned. For several days, the air itself seemed to remember that first voice better than she did. When Arabella opened the window, the garden rearranged its sound, bees quieter, birds less argumentative, as if to leave room for something finer. She told herself it was curiosity, nothing more. Curiosity is the polite name people give to hunger when they have promised not to eat. She saw him again 3 evenings later. The lilacs had thickened into fragrance. The hedge trembled with bees rehearsing summer. Arabella had brought her mending outside, a basket of small garments belonging to her pupils, and took a seat by the sundial where daylight keeps its last appointment. From beyond the hedge came the voice, reading aloud once more, not sermon this time, but story. The listener was again the young woman with the shawl. The reader paused occasionally to translate French phrases for her, which he did badly but charmingly. Arabella smiled before she could help herself. When the chapter ended, there was laughter, soft, familial, not the laughter that wounds. The sister, for she was surely that, teased him for a mispronunciation, and he replied that his talents were military, not musical. "That cannot be true," Arabella said, before realizing she had spoken aloud. Silence. The hedge held its breath. Then the man's voice, amused but unhurried. "I stand corrected, ma'am. Music, it seems, has better ears than modesty." She rose, startled at her own boldness, but he appeared already at the gap in the hedge. "Forgive me," he said. "You endure my voice often enough. It should introduce itself." "Lucien Harcourt, at your service." "Lady Arabella Whitmore," she said, and immediately regretted giving the full title. It sounded like a defense. He inclined his head. "We are neighbors, then. My sister and I have taken the lodge for her convalescence. The air is said to mend both lungs and tempers." "It mends what it chooses," she replied, "and chooses whom it pleases." His eyes were grey. No, not grey. The colour of an old mirror that remembers every face but reflects none without alteration. "Then I must hope it pleases you," he said lightly. The formality of the exchange might have ended there, but the day was too mild for dismissal. The sister called from the path, asking if the lady would join them for tea some afternoon. Arabella, trapped between instinct and etiquette, answered yes. She had not accepted an invitation from anyone outside her pupils' families in years. The word left her mouth with the awkward grace of something that had forgotten how to fly. That night she could not read. The books on her table, all pious, patient things, seemed suddenly less necessary. She sat instead by the window, listening to crickets fuss over tempo. Once she thought she heard again that voice, low and unread, singing perhaps, or merely speaking to someone the dark kept secret. She did not open the shutter. She preferred imagination to evidence. When she did visit the lodge, she went under the pretext of returning a book he had lent her, a volume of verse she pretended to have misplaced. The lodge surprised her. Unlike great houses that attempt philosophy through symmetry, it was built for comfort. Wood, polished by use, windows open to argument with the wind, a dog asleep precisely where visitors might wish to step. Lucien met her at the threshold, one sleeve of his coat empty. The injury, whatever it had been, had not ruined his balance. It had only taught him to value it. "You find us informal," he said, "but we are kind to tea and relentless with cake." His sister, Alice, younger by perhaps 10 years, greeted Arabella as one greets good news confirmed. "He's been quite intolerable since your compliment," she whispered. "Do rescue us from his modesty." The hour passed as hours do when the world forgets to defend itself. They spoke of small things, gardens, the misbehaviour of weather, the virtues of unambitious novels. But under each harmless subject ran another current, quick and quiet: recognition. Lucien listened the way some men pray, as if silence were holy, but answers rarer. He did not fill pauses, he allowed them to ripen. When Arabella rose to leave, he walked her to the hedge. The evening had taken on that suspended light between gold and forgiveness. "I owe you thanks," he said. "For what?" "For reminding me that conversation is not a campaign. One need not win it." She smiled. "And I owe you thanks for reminding me that silence is not defeat." He looked as though he might answer, but something in her expression warned him off. She had drawn a line invisible and absolute, the kind that only the lonely can draw correctly. He bowed instead. "Good evening, Lady Arabella." That night she dreamed of voices, not his, but dozens layered like waves on a shore, voices of the past demanding audience. When she woke, her throat ached with the echo of unsung music. Days grew into a week. She told herself she would not seek him out, yet somehow her errands found new routes past the lodge. Once she heard him at the brook, reading aloud to his sister, poetry again, but this time a line she had once loved. "Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting." The words drifted toward her, recognizable but changed, as though carried on a current of meaning she had not yet swum. She remembered her old vow and touched the ribbon at her throat. Silence had been her armor, now it felt oddly like a door locked from the inside. That evening, she sat at her piano and opened it without plan. Her hands hovered above the keys. She did not play, habit still held power, but she whispered one note into the air, barely a sound, almost a breath. The note trembled, uncertain, then dissolved. And yet when she listened hard enough, she could have sworn she heard an answer, a single tone, low and steady, from somewhere beyond the hedge. She smiled, startled by her own tears. "Perhaps," she murmured, "the garden listens both ways." The following weeks unfolded with the deliberate pace of a waltz, slow, precise, but filled with the secret rhythm of hearts learning each other's language. Arabella and Lucienne met most often by accident and sometimes by design, yet every encounter seemed to carry the quiet inevitability of something long awaited. The garden became their shared country. Mornings, when the mist clung low and the air smelled faintly of lilac and ink, she would find him at the hedge reading aloud for his sister's health, for his own peace, and, though neither of them said it, for her. Arabella listened as one might listen to rain, without interruption, with gratitude, with the faint terror of needing it too much. Lucien's voice had changed since the war. It carried the calm of a man who had learned Paine's grammar and refused to let it dictate his sentences. He read with deliberate slowness, every pause meaningful, every inflection patient. Sometimes he caught her watching, sometimes she pretended not to notice. It was Alice who began the lessons. One afternoon, while Lucienne fetched new books from the library, she turned to Arabella with the ease of someone confessing a conspiracy. "You like when he reads, don't you?" Arabella nearly spilled her tea. "I find it educational." "Indeed." "He says you never sing, and I don't believe him. No one who listens like that is deaf to beauty." Arabella smiled thinly. "Once, perhaps, but not now." "Then he must teach you," Alice said cheerfully. "He's very good at mending what he did not break." Lucienne returned at that moment, saving Arabella from answering. Yet the words lingered, like perfume after a door closes. That evening she found herself standing before the piano again. The keys seemed to stare back, expectant but forgiving. She did not play, not yet, but she laid her hand upon the lid and whispered, "He mustn't know." The piano, being wiser than men, kept her secret. The next day, Lucienne arrived at the schoolroom with a book of poems, Byron, though he apologized for the indulgence. "His excess suits convalescence," he said, "and people in hiding." "Which am I?" she asked. He met her gaze, smiling faintly. "Both, I think." They began reading together. At first she listened while he read, her hands folded in her lap. Then hesitantly she took a verse herself. Her voice trembled on the first word, brittle, barely audible. He did not comment. Instead, he leaned forward, listening intently, as though each syllable mattered more than the world beyond the hedge. "Again," he said softly, but slower. "Let the words breathe." She obeyed, and this time her voice carried further, low but sure. When she finished, he nodded. "There, you see? Sound does not punish, it forgives." The lesson continued for many afternoons. They read everything, psalms and Shakespeare, sonnets and children's rhymes. When she faltered, he steadied her with patience. When she grew bolder, he matched her tone until their voices mingled like chords discovering harmony. One afternoon, he asked if she might hum the line instead of reading it. She froze. "I cannot," she whispered. "Cannot," he said gently. "Or will not." Her breath hitched. "It has been years. The last time I tried, it broke me." He nodded, not in disbelief, but in understanding. "Then let it break again. Broken things are often truer than perfect ones." For a long moment she stared at him, caught between terror and trust. Then she drew a breath and let a single note escape her lips. It was faint, trembling, imperfect, but unmistakably alive. Lucien closed his eyes. The sound was nothing like the polished voice she once wielded on stages. It was raw, uncertain, painfully human. And yet to him it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. When the note faded, she turned away, cheeks wet with tears she hadn't permitted. "I sound dreadful," she murmured. He smiled, not the polite smile of comfort, but something warmer, older. "You sound like truth, and truth is rarely in tune." After that day, the lessons changed. He brought her lines meant not for reading, but for feeling. Passages from Milton, verses of the Psalms. "Read this," he'd say, "and listen to what your own heart replies." Sometimes she laughed at the absurdity. Sometimes she could not finish for the weight of memory pressing in. Gradually she began to hum again, not full songs, only fragments, as if testing whether sound could be trusted. Once, while arranging wildflowers on the table, she found herself humming without realizing it. The melody was wordless, carried by habit and sunlight. When she noticed him standing in the doorway, she stopped, startled. "Do not stop," he said quietly. She shook her head. "You're listening." "Yes," he said. "For years I have heard the world speak through thunder, gunfire, and the cries of men. You are the first music that asks me to listen gently." Her pulse fluttered. "You make dangerous speeches, Lord Harcourt." "I make honest ones," he said, and left before she could respond. That night she could not sleep. His words repeated themselves in her mind, turning into melody, into courage. She rose, lit a candle, and walked to the piano. The flame quivered. Her reflection in the polished lid looked like a ghost about to sing. She pressed a single key. A, and the note filled the small room like memory finding its way home. Her heart pounded, but she pressed another, then another. Slowly a phrase emerged, the beginning of a song she had sung once, long ago, on the night her life ended and began. Her voice joined, hesitant, but growing stronger with each breath. The room trembled with sound, not elegant but alive. Outside, through the half-open window, she did not see Lucien walking in the garden, pausing when he heard her. He did not move, did not speak, only stood beneath the lilacs, eyes closed, hands clenched, as if the sound itself could heal the places no medicine had reached. When the last note faded, she let the silence return, but now it felt changed, not like exile, but rest. And somewhere beyond the hedge, a man who had forgotten hope whispered to the night, Thank you. Spring slipped into summer, and for a brief, almost cruel span of days, the world pretended it had never heard of sorrow. The lilacs gave way to roses, the garden hummed with bees that minded no one's business but their own. Arabella found herself laughing more easily now, her voice, once an endangered species, returning in fragments, a quiet word of praise for a pupil, a line of poetry finished aloud. Each sound felt like rebellion, like resurrection. And then, as life always does when it suspects happiness of gaining confidence, it sent London to call upon her. The visitor arrived one blazing afternoon, a Mrs. Clarendon, widow of a colonel, brisk as vinegar, clothed in lace that whispered of scandal, disguised as virtue. She had come to the country, she said, for the air, though everyone knew she preferred conversation to oxygen. The village fluttered to receive her, and soon the inevitable occurred. She dined at the lodge, where she met Lucian and Alice Harcourt. It took less than an hour for her to mention Arabella. "Lady Arabella Whitmore," Mrs. Clarendon said brightly, stirring her tea with the enthusiasm of someone sharpening a blade. "Why, I knew her in London. A great beauty once, and quite the talk of the season, until that dreadful business." Alice, innocent as sunlight, asked, "What business?" "Oh, my dear," the widow sighed, "surely you've heard. The duel, the fiancé, what was his name? Captain Fairfax, yes. A charming man until he was killed over her honour. A tragedy, of course, though one can't help thinking such things rarely happen without some encouragement." Lucien's cup stopped mid-air. "Encouragement?" he repeated. His tone was polite, but every syllable seemed carved from ice. The widow leaned closer, lowering her voice with theatrical delicacy. "They say she sang to him that night. Some haunting aria drove the poor man mad with jealousy. Men have died for less, of course, but the scandal was unpardonable. She fled London after. I suppose she found peace in your charming valley." Alice's protest was immediate and fierce. "Lady Arabella is kindness itself. You misjudge her." Mrs. Clarendon smiled thinly, like a curtain concealing bad weather. "Perhaps, but grief has strange appetites. I only repeat what was said." Lucien did not answer. He rose, excused himself, and walked out into the garden, where the air felt suddenly thinner. The story, absurd as gossip always is, rooted itself in him none the less. He had seen pain in Arabella's eyes, yes, but what if it were guilt, not grief? What if the vow of silence she carried so devoutly hid not loss but shame? That evening he went to the cottage. The garden between them glowed gold with late light, the lilacs fading into dusky perfume. She was at the window, arranging fresh wildflowers into a vase. Her voice, low and gentle, hummed a tune, one he did not recognize, but it filled him with an ache so sharp it felt almost holy. "Lady Arabella?" he called. She turned, startled but smiling. "Lord Harcourt, I had not expected you." "I might say the same," he replied, stepping closer to the hedge. "I thought perhaps you'd gone to London." "Never," she said. "London and I are no longer on speaking terms." He hesitated. "May I ask why?" The question struck her oddly, half innocent, half weighted with something she could not yet name. "Because London is fond of ghosts," she said softly, "and I no longer care to haunt myself." He studied her face, the calm grace, the steady eyes, and for a foolish moment he nearly dismissed the rumour as a lie unworthy of daylight. But then Mrs. Clarendon's voice returned to him, sharp and insinuating, and his next words betrayed his doubt. "There are things said of you," he began slowly, "things I have never believed yet. One wonders if silence allows truth or merely buries it." Her expression froze, the colour drained from her face. "Who wonders?" He flinched. I meant, people talk as they always do. It changes nothing, I feel, but you asked, she said, and asking changes everything. She set down the vase so carefully that not a petal trembled. You think my silence a disguise, then? A lady's trick to hide her sin? No, he said, stricken. Only I thought you trusted me enough to speak of it. Her laugh was quiet, but it broke something inside him. And I thought you listened without judgment. We were both mistaken. He reached for the hedge, as though touch could mend what words had torn. Arabella. Lady Whitmore, she corrected. The old armour in her name returned like an old soldier to its post. If you must repeat the world's stories, at least use the title it prefers. He bowed his head, ashamed. Forgive me, I spoke clumsily. Clumsiness is the privilege of the innocent, she said. I do not forgive ignorance parading as concern. With that she turned and shut the window, not angrily, but with the soft finality of a page closing on its own ending. Lucien stood there long after the sun had set. When he finally walked away, he did not notice that the roses had begun to shed their petals onto the path between their houses, white fragments of what had once been whole. That night, Arabella did not sleep. She sat by the piano, the same one that had recently rediscovered its voice, and pressed her fingers against the keys without sound. Every word he had spoken replayed itself in cruel, echoing detail. Things said of you. Silence allows truth, or buries it. She whispered to the room. I kept my silence to protect the dead, not to deceive the living. But the walls, like people, offered no reply. At dawn, the cottage looked as though a winter had passed through it. The flowers had wilted in their vase. The window was still closed. When her aunt came to ask about breakfast, Arabella answered politely, but her voice had changed, no longer tentative or shy, but hollow, stripped of music once again. The next day, the piano was covered. The sheet music disappeared. Lessons with the children were resumed, but she spoke only when necessary, and never of him. Across the hedge, Lucien watched from a distance. Regret is a cruel teacher, but it instructs thoroughly. He sent a note of apology, simple, sincere, but it returned unopened. Alice pleaded on his behalf, but Arabella only smiled faintly and said, There are wounds that silence tends better than speech. The garden, once their bridge, became a boundary again. The lilacs withered, the bees moved on, and the valley resumed its older, colder order. But sometimes, in the stillness before nightfall, when Lucien read aloud to no one in particular, his voice faltered mid-sentence, as though waiting for an echo that had once belonged to her. And on those same nights, in the cottage beyond the hedge, Arabella would pause mid-breath, hearing what she tried not to hear, the sound of forgiveness, still unspoken, calling her name in another man's voice. It began with thunder that no one believed in. The morning had been bright, almost mocking in its civility, and by dusk the air hung thick with a promise too heavy to keep. Clouds gathered over the hills like witnesses assembling for a trial. At Whitmore Cottage, Arabella stood at the window watching the wind press its argument against the lilacs, bending them until they bowed. Nature, it seemed, was rehearsing her own confession. It had been 3 weeks since she'd closed her window on Lucien Harcourt's apology. 3 weeks of hollow quiet, of words left unsent, of melodies caught behind her teeth. Her aunt remarked that she had grown pale again. The pupils noticed her temper had grown neat and sharp, like someone tidying herself to avoid collapse. In the garden, the hedge that once linked 2 hearts now stood like a wall built of remorse. Then the knock came. It was Alice, drenched, breathless, half in tears. "Lady Arabella," she gasped, gripping the doorframe. "Please, you must come. He's hurt. Lucien, he—" The rest vanished into a sob. The world, for Arabella, narrowed to a single sentence. She did not ask how or why. She simply moved, cloak, lantern, boots, no thought of propriety or permission. The storm broke the moment she stepped outside, rain lashing with the rage of things too long restrained. The path to the lodge blurred under water, but she knew it by memory, by instinct, by the pulse of her own fear guiding her feet. Alice followed, crying out what words she could. He went to find the dog, foolish creature. It ran toward the river. He slipped, fell. They reached the lodge to find chaos. Servants rushing, a physician bent over a still figure upon the couch. Lucien lay pale, soaked, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. One arm, the injured one, hung limp, useless. His pulse, the physician said, was delicate. The word struck Arabella like blasphemy. She dropped to her knees beside him, heedless of her soaked dress. His skin was cold, his breath shallow. For a long moment she could only stare at the man she had condemned to silence, who now might never speak again. "Lucien," she whispered. No answer. The physician shook his head. "He may not wake. His heart is weak. We must keep him still and quiet." Quiet. The word had been her companion, her defense, her curse. And now it sounded like a death sentence. Something within her, something patient and long-suffering, finally broke. She took his hand, cold and rough, and pressed it to her cheek. "No," she said, "not quiet, not any more." The physician tried to object, but Alice stopped him. "Let her," she whispered. "Please let her." Arabella closed her eyes, drew a trembling breath, and began to sing. At first it was little more than a sound, a whisper of melody, cracked and uncertain like glass, remembering it was once sand. The first notes faltered, trembling under the weight of 5 years' silence. But she did not stop. Her voice, raw from disuse, reached for something beyond fear. The song was one she had not sung since the night of the duel, an old ballad her late fiancé had loved, the one that had once been twisted by gossip into evidence of sin. She sang it now not as penance, but as truth reclaimed. The storm outside roared in answer, wind hammering the shutters, thunder echoing her pulse. Her voice rose, low, fierce, desperate, a plea and a prayer woven together. Alice knelt beside her, tears mingling with rainwater on the floor. The physician stood frozen, hat in hand, as though afraid to interrupt something holy. When Lucien stirred, it was faint. A small twitch of fingers, a flicker beneath closed lids. Arabella saw it and sang harder, louder, until the note cracked, then steadied again. "I'm here," she whispered between verses. "Do you hear me? I broke my vow, do you hear?" His eyes fluttered open, grey, unfocused. He blinked, as though trying to reconcile the living voice with the dream that had been haunting him. "Arabella?" She laughed through tears. Yes, it's me." He tried to speak, but she pressed a finger to his lips. "Hush. For once, let me be the one who speaks." Her voice softened, trembled, but did not falter. "You asked once whether silence buries truth. It does. I buried mine out of fear of hurting, fear of being hurt. I thought if I never sang again, I would be safe. But safety is just another kind of grave." He watched her, his expression somewhere between awe and disbelief. "I heard you," he whispered, "in the garden that first night. I've been listening ever since." She smiled, her tears finally free. "Then live, Lucien. Live and listen again." He reached for her hand, weak, but sure. "You've always been music," he murmured. "I was just too deaf to know it." The storm outside began to ebb, rain thinning to a hush, thunder retreating like an apology. Inside, the fire crackled again, hesitant but hopeful. The physician returned, murmuring approval, but it hardly mattered. The miracle had already taken place. Lucian slept peacefully that night, his breathing even and strong. Arabella remained by his side until dawn, her hand resting lightly upon his. When the first light filtered through the curtains, she realized something extraordinary. Her voice no longer trembled when she breathed. She walked to the window and opened it wide. The air smelled of wet earth and lilac and redemption. Somewhere in the distance, a bird tested a few tentative notes, and she answered it with a hum, soft, steady, certain. Behind her, Lucien stirred. "You're singing?" he said hoarsely. She turned, smiling. "I am, and this time I'm not afraid of who hears me." He reached toward her, still weak, but his eyes shone with life. "Then keep singing, Arabella. The world's been too quiet." And she did. Her song, clear now, free of its ghosts, filled the room and spilled through the open window, out into the valley that had waited 5 long years to hear her voice again. The wind caught it, the trees carried it, and for the first time since grief had stolen her breath, the earth itself seemed to listen in reverence. When she finished, Lucienne whispered the words that had once belonged to Scripture, but now belonged to her. "He restoreth my soul." Morning did not arrive so much as keep a promise. It came in on the soles of the nurse's shoes and the hush of coals settling in the grate. It laid gold along the window sash and waited, politely, to be invited further. At the lodge, the storm's wreckage had arranged itself into meaning, branches like calligraphy on the lawn, puddles mirroring scraps of sky, a single boot print filled with rain that insisted on being a small lake. Indoors, the world had paired itself to essentials: breath, warmth, gratitude. Arabella woke in the chair beside Lucien's bed with the certainty reserved for children and saints. The worst had happened, and it had also passed. He was sleeping without argument, one arm bandaged, the other lying palm up as if petitioning the day to be kind. Alice dozed on the sofa, a shawl crooked like a smile across her shoulder. The physician, who had sat his vigil in a chair too narrow for the epoch it had carried, had left a note. "Stable. Do not let him perform heroics. Men attempt them like sneezes." It was signed with a flourish that forgave the joke its truth. Arabella rose, stiff with joy. She crossed to the window and drew it open an inch. The air smelled washed and purposeful. A thrush, drunk on weather, tried 3 different songs before committing to one. Behind her came the rustle of linen and the particular silence people make when they are trying to be audible without disturbing a miracle. "You stayed," Lucienne said. "I have learned my talent for leaving is not the one the world requires," she replied, turning. "Good morning." He smiled the way convalescents do when the pain has negotiated a truce and left them suddenly wealthy. "Say it again." "Good morning," she repeated, and it felt like a sacrament. He reached for the cup on the stand. His hand faltered. Her hand was already there. Their fingers met over porcelain. No vow was made, but one held. He drank, winced at the weak tea, and asked, "How long?" "Long enough to earn breakfast," she said lightly. "Alice has an arrangement with the kitchen that could feed a regiment." Alice, roused by the mention of food, sat up and applauded the universe. "He lives, we eat, and the river is reminded of its boundaries," she declared. "All is well." There are recoveries that proceed like polite guests, and those that arrive like children late to supper, cheerful, messy, impatient. Lucien's belonged to the latter. Within a day, he had decided walking was research. By the third, he was arguing with the physician about the moral sloth of bed rest. By the fifth, he stood at the open door, leaning on the frame, and practiced the new humility of letting the world come to him, and the world being susceptible to gratitude, obliged. Tenants appeared with eggs and unsolicited weather data. The vicar brought a book of sermons he swore were entertaining. Alice hid it behind a potted fern and left a ribbon to mark the spot where entertainment had been rumoured. Mrs. Pennington arrived with broth and diplomacy. She kissed Arabella's cheek and Lucien's forehead with the exact parity justice demands. "You frightened our valley," she scolded him. "Do not repeat the offence. We are a simple people. We prefer gossip at room temperature." Arabella moved through those days as if learning a house she had once visited in darkness and now saw in morning light. She boiled linen, trimmed wicks, scolded a recalcitrant kettle, read aloud when his voice tired. Sometimes she sang, not arias, not the polished dares of London rooms, but small, useful songs that keep spirits from misplacing themselves, a lullaby misapplied to afternoon, a psalm without its church hat, a tune the thrush had abandoned and she had adopted. Each time she watched him carefully, not to measure the effect. Love should not be an experiment, but to memorize contentment. On the seventh morning, when the physician declared him officially tedious and therefore safe, they walked to the garden together. The ground was still damp with repentance. The lilacs, freshly laundered by storm, behaved like debutantes who had survived their first dance and were scandalized by their own enjoyment. Lucien took Arabella's arm, not as a claim, but as a conversation with gravity. "Mrs. Clarendon has decamped," he said, as if noting a migratory pattern. "She left behind 3 opinions and a ribbon. May the ribbon tie shut what the opinions open." Arabella replied. "I wronged you," he said, stopping beside the hedge, where their 2 worlds had learned to whisper. "It is a short sentence. It has taken me a long time to pronounce it without embroidery." She looked at him fully. The scar along his temple, the new gentleness at the corners of his mouth, the eyes that had learned to surrender sooner than they argued, these were details pity might collect. Love, being more exacting, categorized them as evidence. "You asked a question you did not deserve an answer to," she said. "Then you suffered for it, which you also did not deserve. We have both learned the expense of assumptions." "I will ask differently," he said, "or I will learn to wait until questions turn into invitations." They reached the bench beneath the lilac, their bench now, though neither said so. He sat. She stood a moment, testing the air for presumption. Then she joined him. The hedge, once a barricade, rustled like a curtain between theatre scenes. "Tell me," he said, not pressing, only leaving the door unlatched, "what your silence kept safe." She did not often revisit that room, but the day was polite and the man patient. "I kept a promise made to a boy who died pretending to be a hero," she said softly. "He asked me to sing for him. After, the city made a story and cast me as its author. I locked the door on music because I could not bear for it to be a witness against me. It punished no one but me." She drew the ribbon at her throat between finger and thumb. The key no longer hung there. The box had been opened. The book was no longer a jailer. "When you read that first night, it sounded like breath being returned to a room. I was angry at you for breathing." "I will attempt to breathe more discreetly," he said, and her smile forgave the wit its relief. He straightened, searching his pockets with the expression of a man preparing to be brave in a new dialect. "I have something," he said at last, producing not a ring, but a folded paper, knotted with blue thread. It is a petition, a steward's document, practical, unbeautiful. Alice insisted I fetch a jeweller. I insisted we begin with ink. She took the paper, curiosity resisting caution. It was brief, written in the same hand that had carried psalms across a hedge and a man through a war. Proposal for a household of sound practice. Shared governance, decisions to be sung or spoken but never assumed. Silence, to be honoured as rest, not punishment. Music, to be practised daily, even if only by humming the kettle to a boil. Reading aloud, obligatory on rain days, optional on days when the sky reads to us. Forgiveness, renewed at breakfast. Love, defined as listening without requisitions. At the bottom, signature lines left open in case wisdom arrives after romance. She laughed, and the sound startled a nearby robin into confessing his own happiness. This is the only contract I have ever wished to sign without consulting a solicitor. Then we are lost, he said. And gladly. She folded the paper as carefully as one folds a hand one means to keep. There is one amendment. Name it. Add voice, to be used without apology. Adopted unanimously, he said, and the Parliament of Leaves passed the motion with unseemly enthusiasm. He reached for her hand, not the clasp of possession, but the recognition of a pulse that matched his own. Arabella, he said, and the name landed on the bench as if it had paid its fare. Marry me, not as rescue, not as remedy, as work we choose to do together. Lucienne, she returned, because accuracy is the first courtesy of love. Yes. It was not the sort of yes that seeks a balcony. It was the sort that grows roots. They did not kiss immediately. They sat a while with the decision like people warming their hands at a fire freshly made. Then she turned toward him, and he toward her, and the kiss surprised even the birds with its quiet. It tasted of rain and ink and mornings purchased honestly. No past was erased, none needed to be. What had been forgiven stayed visible, the way a mended crack glints in sunlight and makes a bowl more beloved. By noon, the valley had distributed the news to itself without malice. Mrs. Pennington organized a supper at which nothing heroic was served, and everything tasted like relief. The vicar, a man occasionally interrupted by wisdom, said grace that forgot to lecture. Alice cried into a tart and declared the tears improved the recipe. Arabella sang a little, only a verse, then another when pressed, and Lucien leaned back with the expression of someone listening to the exact clock he wants his life to keep. Later, when the house drowsed and the garden rehearsed twilight, they returned to the hedge for the formality their story demanded. He brought the book from the first night, pages swollen from storm, and opened to the psalm that had once been a bridge. "Will you hear me?" he asked. "I've been hearing you for months," she said. "Read?" He did. And when he reached, "He restoreth my soul," he stopped, because the words no longer needed his voice. They had acquired hers. She sang, not to prove, not to penance, simply because sound had become the native language of her joy. The song rose, found the rafters of evening, and settled there like a lantern. He joined her on the refrain, not in tune, not necessary, until the two lines made a third thing between them, a life. When the last note folded itself into dusk, he spoke the only sentence large enough to close the day without wasting it. "We begin tomorrow." She nodded. "Tomorrow, then." Night came, not as a curtain, but as a companion. In the cottage on the rise, silence took its chair again, not as a tyrant now, but as a friend with good manners, content to share the room with music and the soft, articulate happiness of two people who had learned that love is not the end of sorrow, but its best musician. And in the valley below, the brook resumed its bright argument with the stones, vindicated at last. Even the quiet places sing when listened to correctly.